Is your to-do list a mile long and you somehow find a way to fill every hour of every day? How good are you at resting? Today, we are exploring creating margin for God's design and pattern of rest for us in the midst of our busy lives.
He's a preacher, but not the average kind. He's a preacher, he'll make you laugh till you cry. He'll open your eyes and change your life with food for your soul, unpasteurized. Yeah, it's good for your heart, mind, body, and soul. It'll help you get to heaven, the ultimate goal. So come listen a while, you might be surprised. It's food for your soul, unpasteurized. His sarcasm might make you roll your eyes, but it's food for your soul, unpasteurized.
Welcome to the Unpastorized podcast. My name is Sarah Merriweather.
And I'm Pastor Bruce Dickerson.
We are so glad that you have tuned in. We were just discussing, Pastor Bruce, this is episode number 28 for us.
And you said we're going to make it to 30?
We will make it to 30 whole episodes in our first season.
And then some bonus episodes for July.
Bonus episodes. So we are so glad that you have tuned in. If this is your first episode with us, know that you can jump in at any time. You don't need to go back and listen to all of those other 27, but we would sure love it if you did.
And also, rate us very highly.
Very highly. Subscribe, do all the things. But friends, we are in the middle of our series all about finding margin. We're actually in the fourth episode of a 6-episode kind of series here on finding margin. And some reminders before we get started on today's episode, where you can find us wherever you listen to your podcast audio. You can find the Unpastorized podcast. You can also watch our video component if that's your jam. You can find us on our Spotify channel or on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Jerome Church Online. So as we always say, we want you to get out your Bibles. We're going to spend a little bit of time in Scripture today. We're going to jump around from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Get out your Bibles. One of our goals is to give you some tools to be able to study the Bible, to be in it each day, whether that is a hard copy or YouVersion app or something else on your phone. Get your Bible out and join us as we do that today. Pastor Bruce, would you begin in prayer for us today, please?
Glorious God, we thank you for this day and this time to come together and study and conversation and fellowship. Be with those who are listening and also with Sarah and I as we continue this journey into podcasting. Amen.
Amen. So, Pastor Bruce, as I mentioned, we're in the middle of this series on finding margin. And today we said when we started this series that this was going to be a good one for you and I because we suck at margin.
Yeah.
We're bad.
Like if the instructions said, please don't color in the margins, we would actually only color
outside of them,
the
probably.
Margins. Yeah.
And so today is going to be a challenge, maybe the most challenging episode out of all of them. And that is, we're going to be talking about Sabbath.
What is Sabbath?
Well, we're going to get to that in a moment.
We probably should start with, what is margin?
Yeah, we're going to start there. So as a reminder, as we're looking through this Finding Margin series, I think it's important for us each week, each episode, to be reminded of what we're actually talking about here that Pastor Bruce and I are so bad at. And so we said we're using this working definition. We actually borrowed from a couple of great authors and pastors. The first one is from Andy Stanley, and Andy says, that margin is the amount available beyond what is necessary. And then the second one is from Craig Groeschel, and he says, it's the difference between what you have and what you need. And so, each week we've been looking at different types of margin, and it's been a really, I think, good and encouraging series. Convicting, perhaps.
A lot of conviction.
I
usually tell people that, if you feel angry at one of my sermons or joy or whatever it is, that's the Holy Spirit. So don't get mad at the messenger. I'm just delivering it.
What happens when we say it to ourselves, though? Still the Holy Spirit?
No, it's all your fault.
Fair enough.
I wanted to pause here real quick. I was looking at the definitions and really been thinking about them this past week. And I really don't like the second one.
Okay.
It's a difference between what you have and what you need. So it sounds like it's short. To me, it would be beyond what you need.
Interesting. Yeah. We
Just-
can
just a
adapt
thought.
it in that way.
So,
No,
yeah.
I hear where you're going from with that. I think it's maybe that definition makes more sense when we're looking at things like time
Right.
and finances. But today with Sabbath, we're almost kind of flipping the script a little bit. So
Right.
maybe that's why that definition
Yeah,
feels off.
but also we agreed on the third thing, which is the part of in our scheduled life margin would be having more than enough. And so
That's
for
right.
today's example, more than enough time.
Although, back to kind of maybe your argument and point, Sabbath, as we'll get to in a moment, isn't more than enough time. It is part of the time that God has designed for us.
That's true.
So more than enough time in our current culture.
Yeah,
maybe.
but in margins, really what we're talking about is, once again, lifestyle changes
Right.
and how we look at it.
And I think that's why it's convicting. We're being challenged to make some choices that maybe aren't always the easiest. So a couple of episodes ago, Pastor Bruce, we talked about scheduling margin. That was a good one for you
Right.
and I, and an important piece. And we said this during that episode, that there are two things that are very important to your success and relationship with God. But as soon as we lose margin, these are two things that we usually lose right away first.
Yeah, for some reason, we almost intentionally cut them out first.
And we talked a little bit about, sometimes we think we do that because we know that, God has grace for us and that God's love is going to be ever present, even if we aren't fully in that relationship.
Yeah, very much. Let's treat God like crap because God has to forgive us.
Well, thank you for saying that in an unpastorized way, but that's the truth.
Yeah.
Is that we sort of know, like a good friend or a great spouse, that, no matter how we act, God's still going to be there. And so that's the thing that we let slide. But those two things that we let slide are intentional time with God. And we talked about that some a couple episodes ago. And the second one, which we're going to spend a lot more time on today, is this idea of an intentional time or intentional times of rest.
Yeah, when we lose margin, we feel like we can't afford to take a day of rest. Even for pastors, the pastors oftentimes consider their Sabbath the afternoon Sunday nap.
Yeah, I mean, there are many weeks. I actually just talked to somebody about that yesterday. It's like I'm heading home for the couple of hours of Sabbath that I have each week, and they sort of like, that's terrible, Sarah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it is, and I don't think that just happens to people in the ministry world. I look at my husband, who works a more typical 9 to 5, Monday to Friday type of schedule, more hours than that, but
Right.
In general, and he still very much struggles to find time on his days off on Saturday and Sunday to not work. He usually has his computer nearby, or to actually find times of real rest. So not to call you out there, Rob, but, but a little bit. I just want to say that I think it applies everywhere. Even if I was a stay-at-home parent for a while in my life before I was in ministry, and even that actually might have been a harder time to find Sabbath rest, because I was always on as kind of a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah, Christy and I have started to talk about what's life going to be like with Abby going off to Bowling Green. And the reality is we go, oh, we'll finally have time to do, and so we're already filling the time.
We have a habit of filling the time that we have. And so I think the question that we can ask, and we asked it a couple, episodes ago, but we'll ask it again because it's good, is why don't we trust God's plan and design for us?
Well, because we're sinful.
Well, this is true. But I mean, I think the reminder here is that if it was good enough for God, like, is it not good enough for us? Is that actually what we're saying? I mean, are we saying that God's principles aren't true, or that, worse, that we think we're more important or busier than God?
Well, yeah, that's actually what we're saying is our plan is better. And we just don't call ourselves out on it. And it also goes, leaning into, when we talk about sin, we're leaning oftentimes into a worldly nature or a worldly plan, which doesn't necessarily have our best interests at heart, where God does. But I love what you just said there also about the aspect of, are we saying that it's better than what God did? Is God took a day of rest.
Yeah.
And I think that's the point we kind of need to launch in to understand, is why Sabbath?
Yes. And so, as we mentioned, we're going to look at this pattern that God sets for us in terms of rest. And at first, we actually find it in the book of Genesis. So we're not going to read from Genesis today, but in the creation stories, actually, in Genesis, we see that God takes a day of rest and says it was good.
Yeah. On the seventh day, he looked at everything and he rested.
He rested. And so we are going to start here. We're going to jump ahead a little bit here to the book of Exodus, actually, as we, come across the Israelites who have now left Egypt on their way to the promised land, and they're getting some rules. Okay, from God. And we've covered this in some episodes previously, but would you like to read for us here, Pastor Bruce, from the book of Exodus, all about the Sabbath?
Yeah. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your sons or daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy.
That's right. And so just as a reminder, this is from Exodus chapter 20, and this is the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
So this isn't just a nice, word from God about taking a day of rest. This is...
Thou shalt.
This is, stone tablets coming down from the top of the mountain.
Finger of God.
Yeah.
Writing all that in.
This is big stuff. And so... first of all, I think it's important for us to see that this is a pattern that God established, first of all, for the Israelites, for Jewish people. And we'll talk about that in kind of a moment here about how, we maybe as Christians have changed that a bit, our understanding of what Sabbath is. But I want to be clear, and I think we want to be clear here today, that even though our Christian understanding is different somewhat from the Jewish observance and understanding of Sabbath or Shabbat, we still firmly believe that God has intended for us times of intentional rest in our lives. And
there's nothing like being in Jerusalem near sundown on Friday.
Oh, I bet that is incredible.
It's all the storekeepers are running around and like closing up their shops and sliding things. And then it's like it goes from complete chaos to just nothing. Amazing.
It's
beautiful.
Recently reading a book about Sabbath, and they were talking about the margin. Interestingly, that was actually the word they used, that devout Jewish observers of the Sabbath take, the margin on either side of Sabbath to make sure that they aren't observing it correctly. So kind of we're suggesting that the more devout a Jewish person is, the bigger the margin on either side of beginning and ending the Sabbath.
Yeah.
That traditionally, I think it's just before sundown, it begins. And then I think I read something like when 3 stars appear in the sky on Saturday night, that's when Sabbath ends. That was an interesting description. But they were saying that, it can go longer by 40 to 80 minutes, depending on the way that, someone follows that. So I found that fascinating. I mean, there's so much that we can learn, even from modern day Jewish people and the way that they honor and observe the Sabbath. It's something that it's a pattern of rest that we are grafted onto that, tree of faith. That's the roots of our faith that I think it's important for us to understand.
Right. But you actually, when we were talking, we talked about the United Methodist Church, because that's where we're coming from, their understanding of Sabbath, and we both went, ugh.
Yeah, didn't love it. And so, it's important for us to start from a Christian perspective, because that's what we are. We're Christ followers. And we specifically are part of the denomination called the United Methodist Church. So it's important to understand what our faith background has to say about Sabbath, about any topic that we talk about on here. And so, I do think it's important for us to sort of review that, at least for our listeners and for you and I, and we can let them maybe struggle with it in the same way that you and I did a little bit. But, it is a Jewish practice. And so it's important to understand how we got here as Christians to kind of our modern day understanding of what Sabbath is. And maybe that will help us understand why we suck at it, why
Right.
we're so bad at it.
And so you just heard us say that the Jewish tradition was from sundown on Friday till sundown on Saturday.
That's right.
That is the day of Sabbath, and Sabbath is often called Shabbat. Is it's spent in church and with family, and there is no working. And depending on what branch, almost like denomination, are you Orthodox, are you Reformed, that there are certain rules they had to be followed. So like when I was in seminary and had to do some study, I actually had to go to a Shabbat service, and like I wasn't allowed to take notes because writing is considered work.
Wow.
When they go downstairs to share a meal, the ovens were already turned on and they were left on the whole time because turning on an oven was considered work.
Okay. Yeah.
And so we have that kind of understanding of, there were just certain rules. So understand that's where we're coming from. And then something happens in that time of the transition when Sabbath changed. If you remember, it goes back actually, and I'm going to come away from the notes real quick just to explain a little bit more how we got here, is you have to remember that when Jesus died on the cross, there was a rush to place him in the tomb because tradition holds that was on a Friday.
Right.
And so it was the day of Sabbath. And so they rushed him to the tomb, prepared him as quickly as possible, closed the tomb, and then went off for pretty much 24 hours.
Which is why the women returned early in the morning on Sunday.
Correct.
That was the first daylight after Sabbath had ended.
And so they had to come, because we're not talking about they were going to go prepare the body right after Sabbath, because there are certain things you have to do. But they show up first thing in the morning. And so that would have been Sunday.
Yes. And so somewhere along the lines, as our UMC, sort of background tells us, is that the Lord's Day and the Sabbath were sort of conflated together, right? We brought these two together, and that we don't have the traditional observance of the Sabbath, but it is important for us to know that God still has this pattern of Sabbath rest for us. So the thing that we struggled with a little bit here was that Sabbath or Shabbat actually means the seventh day. So Sabbath was Saturday, and along the lines, because you mentioned, Sunday was Resurrection Day. That was the Lord's Day. So as these two sort of religions come together and you have people operating in them, the Jewish Sabbath day of Saturday, the seventh day, Christians did not observe in that same way. They had the Lord's Day, which was Sunday. And there were, a mix of that. So there were some Jewish Christians that still did both. And it became, a bit confusing, I think.
Because for Christians, Sundays became little Easters, mini Easters. Right. Every Sunday we're actually celebrating the Lord's resurrection.
Mm-hmm. And so, when Christianity became an official religion, according to the Roman government at the time, that became the time when Christians gathered for public worship. It was no longer necessarily a day of work, which it had been before. They were allowed to gather for worship. And so that sort of became the Christian Sabbath day, but it really was the Lord's Day. And I think where you and I struggle with this from a United Methodist perspective was this end. Actually, in their description of it, they say the Sabbath remains, as it always has been, the seventh day, the day of rest for observant Jews. And, we struggle with that because we said, well, are they suggesting that we as Christians don't need or observe a Sabbath?
Right. And the confusing thing is, once again, we love this word, conflated.
Yeah, it's a good word.
Is this idea that we combine them, but yet they're still really two separate things.
They are. And so, as a lifelong Christian, I've grown up in the church. To me, Sabbath was always Sunday. Right. And so I don't want to say this was surprising to me. I know that the Jewish Sabbath is a different day. I guess I just wasn't really considering that our Sabbath day as Christians isn't Sunday.
Right.
Anyway, so I don't know that we've really straightened this out at all for people, but I think what it does boil down to, where we can agree with what the United Methodist Church has to say about it, is that we can trust that, God has set a life-giving model for us in terms of having a regular period of rest.
I think that's the important
what
thing.
day we do it on, or what we call it, maybe is less important than
actually having it,
having the time.
And what
rest.
does it look like? Because I think we've confused Sabbath with, man, I get a little bit of a nap and I'm okay. And no, it's actually a pause in our busy life. And we're going to talk about that more.
We are. And, so it is still a command. So we read this as part of the 10 Commandments. But we've actually covered this on other episodes as well, that, the reality is, we have Jesus, and that is what sets us apart as Christians. We believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And so Jesus comes as the new covenant, and not as a replacement for the law, as we've covered, but as a fulfillment of the law.
And Jesus actually fulfilled, in the sense that, upheld Sabbath law.
He did, practiced it while he was here, but also has some interesting words to say to his disciples in Mark, in the book of Gospel of Mark, chapter 2. And we're actually going to read from verses 23 through 28 here. So this, in my version of the NIV, is actually titled, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. That's what that sort of section is, has some words above it. So here are these words from the Gospel of Mark. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He, meaning Jesus, answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath."
Yeah, that's kind of complicated.
It's complicated, but Jesus likes to be complicated, likes to turn things upside down for us a little bit, challenge us, and I think there's meaning in there. But here's what I think we can take away from it, Pastor Bruce, is this reality that humans struggle with rules. We don't like them, but we also like to make sure that other people follow them.
Right, and the Pharisees are a prime example of making sure everybody's following the rules, not always themselves.
Right. But a lot of times I think we struggle to follow the rules because we want to know the why behind them. I think about like my kids here, for example. When I would have, even now, maybe even more so now that they're teenagers.
You mean your teenagers ask why?
They ask why. And it's an important part of learning. And so I don't mind when they ask why. I mind when they disagree with the why. Is that fair? But I don't mind when they ask why, because I think that's a part of how we understand and want to know, okay, why are we following these rules? But
because I said so.
But, I want to use...
Doesn't work.
I want to use this example, okay? Right. So I think maybe we can boil it down to this, that there were a lot of people, maybe the Pharisees in this case, who saw Sabbath as like a routine to be followed.
Right. It became very much like we talk about, and sometimes people come to church just to check it off.
Sure. Happens, yes, in Christianity as well. But on the flip side of that, sometimes dull routines can be life-saving. And so, borrowing this example from a devotional I was just reading, but think about brushing your teeth, Pastor Bruce. Is that something you enjoy doing? I mean, do you set aside time to brush your teeth?
Well, yes, but
okay, but
I know
not
what you're getting
really.
To. No, it's not like on my calendar.
Right. We're not scheduling margin for brushing your teeth.
Oh, I'm going to bed. I'll brush my teeth. Oh, I'm waking up.
So when my kids were little, they did not love to brush their teeth. It was not their favorite thing to do. And, you think, well, I'm not going to brush my teeth. They're whatever. They don't see the consequences of it. But you don't really see the consequence of not brushing your teeth until they all fall out. I mean, right?
That went really, wow.
Listen, I'm a child of a dentist, okay? So I am very pro brushing
I thought we were at least going to talk about the gum disease, gingivitis.
I mean, we could, but what I think Jesus is saying here at the end of this Mark scripture is what Jesus is really saying is not about brushing teeth, but we're not meant as human beings to serve the Sabbath any more than we're meant to serve our toothbrushing. Okay,
I see where you're going.
But
kind of.
But what we're meant for is for that pattern to serve us. It's a pattern designed by God to bring us blessing.
Yeah, and I think that really is the important aspect.
Yeah.
Is once again, it's another aspect of trusting God, as we talked about. But the aspect is really Sabbath is a blessing.
It is.
If we do it and stop looking at it as just free time to do what we want to do,
or a dull routine like brushing our teeth. Right. It's not meant to burden us. It really is meant to bless us. And so it shouldn't be a chore. It should be something that we look forward to and that we are anxious to participate in, because we know that we will meet God there, and that is God's design for the way that we spend our lives.
Yeah, well, and I brought up that example earlier of being in Jerusalem. It was chaos in motion, because in some ways it was, if I don't get this thing shut down, I'm going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
And it almost became, instead of something, the chaos, it seemed more of a burden than anything else. And almost a chore. Yeah. Like you said. And so it's that rough thing. And I agree with you. I think many Christians look at Sabbath as a chore. But also I think we've lost it so much they don't even understand what it is.
Well, I was going to say, I'm not sure that we look at it as a chore, because I don't think we even value it as important anymore. It's just one of those things that goes away when we run out of time, run out of margin. And so, I think what we've got to remember here is that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, that Jesus is the fulfillment of God's good rules, this new covenant. And, God knows and demonstrates that regular rest is one of the rhythms that actually leads to abundant life. And so when we ignore it, we are really ignoring God's plan for us. And we talked about this in our last episode. What it really comes down to, it's kind of a lack of faith. It's a faith issue. Do we not trust God enough to set aside some time for intentional rest so that God can help us live this life worthy of our calling? I think that's our biggest challenge.
But also on top of that, there are real health repercussions for not having Sabbath. And I talk about that in my sermon much more. So I encourage you, if you have not heard the sermon, to listen to the sermon. Yeah. Because there are things, we talk about, we serve this God of abundance, and that includes rest, that God wants us to be healthy so that we can live a life of God's plan, which should be the norm. Yeah. But once again, the norm is that of the world.
We're going to get to this in our second segment today, but really it's the reminder that we are way more than what we produce, right? I mean, that's the bottom line for us.
Right.
We are much more than what we produce in God's eyes. So we're going to take a quick break, but kind of a related break here on our Fun Fodder segment for the day, Pastor Bruce. As we mentioned, you and I not so good at Sabbath days of rest, but it is tough working in the church, as you mentioned, that Sunday is not usually our Sabbath day, because we're working a good bit of it. For example, yesterday was a Sunday, and I was at church in the morning working. Though I love being here, it is not the most worshipful experience for me, because we're on kind of leading things. And then in the evening, I was so excited to host youth group at my house, which was wonderful. And I loved having all those teens there, and they had a great time together, but there wasn't a lot of space for Sabbath rest on that day. And so, but I do think it's important for us, when all of us, when we find time for actual rest, what are some of the things that you enjoy doing? That's our fun fodder for the day.
Actually, for me, it's getting out into nature, and I enjoy fishing.
Yes.
That's time with God for me, as I just sit there. and can contemplate. It's not even about, you've always laughed at me because I said it's not about catching the fish.
Yeah.
I'm a fly fisher, and so it's finding that perfect rhythm for cast, because that makes me feel like I'm finding a rhythm with God.
I love it. I am anxious for you to get back out and do some more fishing. That'd be great for you. For me, I would like to suggest that golf is that activity for me, but
ruins a perfectly good walk in nature.
Well, I actually love being on a golf course. I love that, but I've played competitively for so long that I do feel this sort of need to produce when I'm on a golf course, and it's not as relaxing perhaps as it could or should be. And so I find rest in, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next segment, but in being creative, in creativity that doesn't have a real purpose. I like to create things. I enjoy cooking. That's a great way for me just to kind of rest, like the actual process of cooking it when I don't have to just throw food at my family within a half an hour when everybody's home. I enjoy that aspect, and I also just like being in nature. I mean, I grew up on some beautiful land out in the country, and there's nothing like just being in nature, particularly if it's near some turquoise blue water in the Caribbean.
Right.
That's my favorite.
Real ocean.
Yeah. Well, real ocean. Right?
Yeah.
Yes, for me. But rest is important. And so, friends, I think our challenge and what we hope you'll hear from this today is if you don't have a regular pattern of rest, first of all, we want you to figure out how to find that. Find some margin. And we're going to talk about types of rest and things in this next segment. But, find that thing that brings you some joy, brings you some rest, brings you that good feeling when you do it, and make some more time for that.
I actually bought a new hammock, and I'm looking forward to setting it up out in the yard.
Yeah.
Get all the bird feeders all full again. And the squirrel food all sitting there so that chubby little squirrel can come over and sit there again. I sent that video to you earlier this week.
Yeah. Well, I know I teased you last week about your tiny tractor.
I know.
But you enjoy that. That is rest for you.
I love my yard work.
You do.
I do.
You do, because I would agree with you. I love some yard work. I actually used to work on golf courses, and I loved the act of mowing things because there was a sense of completion to it. Like you would do that and you're like, that looks good. And you can feel good about what you've accomplished.
My family actually is laughing at me this week because it's like this past week was just so busy, the past couple of weeks, that I went out and realized how big some of the plants had gotten. And so we're growing green beans on our vertical trellis. And so the fact that they're starting to wrap around a little bit, like last week they just started to wrap around, and now they're like 2 feet off the ground. Yeah. And they're like laughing at me because I'm going, look how tall they're getting. And they're like, yeah, they're supposed to do that. They don't get as thrilled as I do. So friends, find a way to rest, whether it's growing green beans or making dinner, whatever that looks like for you. Bake some bread.
Find some Sabbath day activities that you can do, because we're going to give you some different types of rest here in this next segment. So as we enter our second and final segment of the day, Pastor Bruce, how really is it that we're going to live out this idea of Sabbath? So in the first segment, we talked a bit about, what it is, why we do it, what the Bible has to say about it. But we haven't yet really talked about the practicality of it. How are we going to, first of all, sort of create some margin for this? Maybe we can use those tips and tricks we learned in scheduling margin. But, once we have some margin for it, how do we live this out?
Well, I think there's several things. Does it have to be Sunday? No.
Oh, good.
Does it have to be Saturday? No. The importance is that you find regularly intentional scheduled time to set aside as a day of rest. Mm-hmm. So don't get lost in the rules and legalism and let your busy schedule tell you that you can't find time for rest.
Right, because if we ask a lot of people today, hey, you need to set aside a whole day for Sabbath, I don't think most people are at that level of margin yet. And so I think what we want to suggest today is if you can't set aside a whole day, that's okay. Start with a few hours, but set aside some intentional time for rest.
Right.
A whole day is God's design.
Right. And actually, I I kind of disagree with you.
I'm okay with that.
And I'm somebody who is a master of, I had my Sabbath this week. I got 32 minutes there, and I got,
Yes, we've done that before. That's why we're bad at it.
But you and I both, if we're really honest, need to go, Friday is supposed to be my day of Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Either Friday or Saturday becomes my day off day. So I just need to actually put down my phone, let the congregational leadership team know you're not going to be able to get a hold of me. It's going to be like old time pastor, not on 24-hour notice. And I need to spend time with the Lord. And it's kind of like when we talked about tithing, where we said, waiting to tithe until you're financially capable of tithing is a lot like waiting to, breaking your leg and letting it heal up and then going to the hospital.
It's fair.
It doesn't make sense. If you're going to do it.
Yeah.
Make it important. Schedule it first.
Where I would challenge, I agree with you. First of all, I mean, that is the ideal, that we have that full day.
But start somewhere.
I think what I have a tendency, at least in my own life, so maybe this really only applies to me, or if you're like me out there, I have a tendency to not do things if I can't do them perfectly. All right. I have that perfectionist streak. And so I know for myself that I have this tendency that if I can't give a full day each week for Sabbath, just whatever, I have a lot of scheduling things going on.
Then you won't do it at all.
Then I won't do it at all. And so I think that's the caution I want to give is, yes, shoot for that ideal. If there are, if there's a week, if there are weeks, if that's a pattern you can create where you have a full day, whether it's a Tuesday, I don't know what it is for you, please do that. We want you to have a full day of rest, and we'll talk about those types of rest here in a moment. But if you can't quite get there yet, what does it look like to set aside, to start with an afternoon?
Right.
To start with a morning, or even just a few hours in the midst of your week for that. I do think in the sense that it is as much about the intention as it is about the hours. We need an intention of rest so that we can come away and be refreshed and better connected to God. And so we can't let our, worldly schedules dictate on a super busy week where you're pulled in all directions going, well, I just don't have time for Sabbath. Got to create some intentional time for that.
And I think we have to grow in our understanding of Sabbath also, is what's work and what's not, what's production and what's not.
Yeah.
And so for you and I, it may be just setting aside anything dealing with work. Doesn't mean that we can't take our kid, we can't go join a baseball game with the kids. It doesn't mean that we can't have to run them around and stuff, but what's work and what's not. And sometimes for us, I'll speak for myself, is my work and my life blend together.
Oh, mine do as well.
So much as I've got to figure out how to separate those.
And I don't want people to hear either that we're suggesting that Sabbath is just lay on the couch all day. It's not just nap time. I know we love naps.
I love a good nap.
Naps are good, but it is more than that.
We actually talked a little bit more of that. But I think when we define these types of rest, that will help us.
I agree. So let's go there. So there's actually a doctor, Sandra Dalton Smith, MD. She's the author of a book called Sacred Rest. And in that, she writes that rest is the most underused, chemical-free, safe, and effective alternative therapy available to us. I thought that was a fascinating quote. So we're not even talking about it from a Christian or religious perspective. We're just talking about the value of rest to the human body. And she developed this concept of 7 rests, 7 types of rest for our body and mind that we need to combat chronic rest deficits. So we're looking at this not necessarily from the spiritual realm, but I do think it is very applicable to our understanding and way that we practice Sabbath.
I agree. And let's talk about the first one real quick, which is the nap. It's the physical rest.
That's right.
Which physical rest is also making sure you get enough sleep at night.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We talked about when we scheduled margin. When we talked about scheduling time margin, we talked about that the day is actually split up into 3 8-hour units.
Yes.
Okay, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for work, and 8 hours for recreation and other stuff. I mean, let's be honest, folks. Doing laundry doesn't count necessarily as work. That kind of comes in the recreation of doing stuff, and so we have to.
It depends on who you ask and how much laundry you have to do. But
fair enough, I get it. One of the reasons we're looking forward to sending Abby off, less laundry. But the reality is sometimes to keep the household going. For some people, that's work. For other people, that's just part of that recreation time that we have to do.
Yeah, and actually, some people take great joy and rest in that. I think depends on
like
different
me
personalities.
mowing the lawn.
For sure. When we were thinking about physical rest, this popped into my mind. We have a sleep number bed. Okay. So I get this report and it will tell me what my sleep number score is. If anybody out there has sleep number bed, you know what I'm talking about. But interestingly, my very top sleep number score, like by a lot, I normally am somewhere in probably the low 80s because I have a lot going on and I tend to toss and turn and think about things at night. But my highest sleep number score, so my best score by far in the last maybe year, was actually the night of Christmas Eve. And I found this fascinating. And when I really thought about it, working in the church, Christmas Eve's kind of a big deal for us. And this year it was a very big deal because it was a Sunday. So we had a very long Christmas Eve day.
So basically you passed out.
I think that's what happened. But what I, was sort of enjoying and laughing about that was that I think it was a true sign kind of these other types of rest that we're going to talk about, that my body was finally able to let go of the stress and the things that keep me tossing and turning, because I had, we had accomplished this great thing on Christmas Eve. And my kids are old enough now, they didn't wake us up early in the morning. And I got the full amount of sleep at the right time. And I was truly resting. And, I need more high sleep number scores, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. What were your sleep number scores the month before that, which we refer to as Advent?
Well, they were terrible.
Well, okay,
they were terrible. And, so when you look in comparison, it was pretty bad. In fact, I was up, to just full transparency, I think I slept maybe an hour on the night of the 23rd, getting everything ready for these, 80 worship services. It was, 5, but 5 worship services in one day, and plus some online worship services. And so we had a lot going on that day, and I slept very little leading up to it. And that also, I'm sure, led to it that I was just physically exhausted.
At a girl, 1 in 23.
Yeah. There you go. So, but anyway, so that's that first type of rest, is physical rest. And so, friends, it's important to rest your body, but find a pattern that works for you. Go to bed at the time that your body says you should go to bed. Wake up at the time your body says you should wake up, and figure out how to work that into the rest of your schedule.
Get your circadian rhythm all back in order.
That's right.
The second one is something I'm terrible at, and that is mental rest. Mm-hmm. I told you many times. First of all, transparency is how I work. I work during the day, and then I go home and I spend some time with my family, and both the girls usually are either upstairs or in bed by 9 or 10. And then I proceed to work until 1 or 2 in the morning. And if I'm not working, I typically fall asleep in my chair, which is why my sleep number is always wrong, because I usually head upstairs about 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning. This morning it was 4. But part of that is that I've told you many times that, you go, hey, you look tired. I said, yeah, I was up building machines last night. And that is my family terminology for I was up thinking.
Yeah. And so some ways that we can get mental rest are things like journaling, prayer time, maybe less spiritual side of things. Our culture sometimes refers to as like a brain dump, right? It's how do we just get all the things out that are stressing us out? And, how do we turn off these brains that are just constantly working? You may have I used to do a lot of yoga, and a lot of the reason I did yoga was for that mental rest aspect of it.
Yeah. Having a brain dump scares me, because I feel like if I stick something into my brain and something dumps, it's going to be something like my name.
Okay. Well, that sounds like maybe more of a personal problem there, Pastor Bruce, but let's move.
Maybe your name. It's Pastor Bruce and What's her name?
Who knows? But our third type of rest here that she lists is called sensory rest. And again, I really like these because I think physical and mental rest are probably ones that I don't want to say more familiar with, but these 7 types of rest really help me understand that sometimes you don't just need a nap. Sometimes you need rest in these other ways. And so sensory rest is this idea that we have so much noise in our lives, and that, from nothing else than just having our tiny little computer phones with us all the time.
Yeah.
And that we need to find some time where our senses can sort of be at ease. And maybe that's why you and I enjoy being in nature.
Yeah. Turning off the radio, getting away from your screens. We are bombarded with screens.
Mm-hmm.
I have a relative who every so often it's like float therapy.
Oh.
Where they go and they float. It looks like a little egg kind of thing, but it's dark and, there's no sound. And, that actually sounds delightful to me.
That sounds a little bit scary to me. I mean, I am a person, I always have like music and things on, sensory rest is probably not something I'm good at all.
Yeah, well, it kind of sounds like the pitch for the Alien movie. In space, they never hear you scream.
Or The Quiet Place or whatever. Yeah, it's a lot. But anyway, sensory rest is important. This next one is emotional rest. This is maybe a more challenging one, Pastor Bruce, but it's this idea that we need to stop suppressing our emotions. What's the most common lie? I'm
okay.
Yeah,
I'm
fine. And so here in this idea of emotional rest is that it is important for us to share things in Christian community with a counselor, with your spouse, with a trusted friend, with someone. Just before we started today, I had something that was bugging me. What I say to you, I'm like, I don't need you to fix this. I just need to tell you this is bothering me.
Yes, it was the vent moment.
Right. And it wasn't about you. It was just a thing. And I said, I just need to get this out. And you're like, well, do you need me to do anything about it? Nope. I just needed some emotional rest from it. I just needed to say it out loud. And so stop suppressing those emotions. If you're not fine, don't say you are.
Yeah. And I just don't have feelings. So that, that makes this one easy. Finally, social rest is a big one for me.
Yeah.
I've discovered over time, everybody would say I'm probably an extrovert, but I'm an extrovert until I'm out of words, or as you like to say, Pastor Bruce has run out of good words.
Yes. You rarely run out of words, but you often run out of the best words.
Yeah. Like the other day we recorded 2 podcasts, my sermon, and then we had a leadership team that night, and we got halfway through leadership team. And if you don't know, Sarah is sometimes known as the Bruce translator.
Yeah.
This is a Pastor Bruce Lander, when I say something and she goes, what he meant was, he loves you. Right.
I do try it, particularly with our staff, and they are grateful for that. But whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, I agree with you. I tend to think of myself as an extrovert, but I get worn out by people pretty quickly, and I need just alone time to recharge. And so understand your patterns, and maybe you fall somewhere in the middle of being an introvert and an extrovert. Understand what you need to recharge and what that rest looks like for you. And if you need to back away from a situation or say no to something, that's okay.
There's that no word.
There is that no word.
And we've talked about that, my wife and I, as I go home and she's the one who gets her words out. And so I leave space for her to talk. And then she goes, okay, I'm done. And then I can just shut down.
Yeah. But I like that you guys have that pattern set up, so at least you're aware. This next one here is really one that I mentioned already today. Is super important to me, and that is this idea of creative rest. So, Pastor Bruce, you and I are creative people. We create in different ways, but I do, aside from content creation here, podcasts and videos, I also do a lot of our graphics, and I actually have a background in design, sort of art related. And so I think it's difficult if you're a person who creates anything, and frankly, all of us create something, to some level. But if you're creating things, we can live with this pressure to produce. And sometimes we just need to create for the sake of creating. And so I shared with you and maybe even here on the podcast previously that I've recently started, I bought myself a watercolor sketchbook. And because I love to paint, I love to watercolor, but it's not something I make space or time for anymore. And what I was recognizing is a lot of the reason I would not do it is because I would feel like I had to produce something. I would feel like I had to create a perfect art piece that was frameable. Well, I'm not going to frame everything I create. And so by purchasing this sketchbook, I realized it actually afforded me some level of creative rest and creative freedom, that I could paint something, I could enjoy the process of it, and maybe it was total junk, or maybe it was the best thing I've ever painted, but ultimately I could just turn the page and shut the book and be done with it. But I had that process. I enjoyed that process while I was doing it. There was rest for me in that. So I know, you talked a little bit about some of your creative rest as well.
I like tying flies. I like zentangling, doodling. I have to do something with my hands. My biggest complaint is, and you always laugh when I say this, is even Jesus made a chair at some point.
It's true. I mean, he was in the family of carpenters, right? He made a chair. That's right.
Is for me, sometimes the creativity, I feel I need to, it's not produce, but it's something that it's tangible.
Yeah.
As I work in a world that feels like intangibles. And so at the end of the day, I like to see, so there's a period of time where I'd go home every night and I would tie a fly. And that really helped.
Yeah.
I'm at a point I need to do that again, probably.
I think we, when we're constantly producing content, which you as a pastor, as a preacher, you're doing that pretty much week in and week out. And same with the podcast. We're here creating content and making sure that we have good stuff, hopefully, to push out. And we have to find some periods of rest where sometimes we're allowed to create just for the joy of the creation. And you and I chatted, I wonder if that's a little bit where God came from. When you think about the creation story, was part of our creation just that God took joy in it?
Oh, I think that's most of it is the aspect of love.
Yeah.
Is we talk about God was perfect before creation, didn't need to create, was in perfect relationship and perfect all these things.
Yeah.
So wanted to.
Yeah, but we're created to create. We should find some joy, and it shouldn't always be, us looking at it and producing something that's great. Then this last one, I think, is very important to us. And I found it interesting that even in a secular sort of idea here, that this last type of rest was listed as very important. And that is this idea of spiritual rest. And this is connecting with God on new and deeper levels during the time that you have, and allowing yourself margin to do this. So
for prayer, for reading the Bible, for reading period about God.
Yeah.
Lots of books, devotions, being in relationship with others. This is where worship becomes a part of Sabbath.
Correct.
And United Methodist potlucks and, campfires and those kind of things to build that spiritual connection with God, sometimes on your own with God and sometimes in community.
Absolutely. Even the, youth pool party at my house last night was opportunity for them to have some spiritual rest with each other. They did a devotional time, and then they just were in Christian community together. And that is so important at every age for us. So, Pastor Bruce, I think that really what Sabbath shows us is that, thank goodness, we are worth more than what we do or what we produce.
Yeah, our rest and enjoyment are so important to God that He made it part of His law. He didn't say go and produce this and that. Matter of fact, the only thing He said was actually go out into the world and be fruitful. Multiply and be fruitful. And so it's about the relationship. We are more valuable to Him than the stuff we produce.
Thank goodness. In light of eternity, the stuff of this world is only temporary. And so our relationship with God is that thing that goes on. And I'm grateful that God thinks I'm more important than the stuff I make.
Yeah.
and the things that I do.
So where have we been?
Well, Pastor Bruce, today we discovered really what Sabbath is and how we as Christians can live into this pattern of rest that God has for us, and maybe even, the differences between our Jewish friends and the culture that we've kind of been grafted onto, and how we operate and practice Sabbath as Christians today.
Right. And Sabbath is God's rhythm to bless us. It's not a requirement. It's not supposed to be burdensome. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath.
Yeah. Even when those words are hard and Jesus is confusing, which I think sometimes he can be, don't know that's his intention, but we can know that Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and that is the fulfillment of that law. So some types of rest, Pastor Bruce, we also looked at that. We looked at how we can find a pattern of rest, and ultimately, while I know you do have some opinion about finding a whole day, and I agree with you there, but that, friends, what we want you to remember here is its intention over ours. Don't be legalistic about Sabbath. It's God's pattern designed for you, not the other way around.
24 hours a day.
It's important. Now, do we think you can find some time for that? We think you should.
I think if it's important, you find time.
As we've said.
But if you have some questions and want to learn more, or you're going through something that we can be praying for you for or with you, there's several ways to contact us.
That's right. You can email us at podcast@jeromechurch.org. You can also find us on our social media. We are on Instagram and Facebook at the Unpastorized Podcast. You can find us on those places and comment, or you can comment on our Spotify and YouTube channels when you watch us or listen online.
And remember that we have new episodes dropping each and every Monday. And even when we're taking some Sabbath time in July, we are pre-recording some mini episodes that will be dropping the Mondays of July. And then, very exciting, we will be starting Season 2 of the Unpastorized Podcast.
Yes, it will be coming up in August. So until next time,
I'm Pastor Bruce.
And I'm Sarah. And this has been the Unpastorized Podcast.